Good evening, everyone, and welcome. What a beautiful evening. And I can hear my email inbox blowing up. I have a feeling that quite a few are out enjoying this beautiful weather and are asking for a recording. And our webinar will be recorded, and to everyone who did register, I will send the recording link. Again, welcome. I'm Don Kinzler, the NDSU Extension Horticulture Agent here in Cass County, and I'm coming to you from my office this evening. And now, for anyone who is new to these Zoom webinar type of events, everyone's camera is automatically off, so you don't have to worry if there's a dog wagging its tail in the background. And also, uh, everyone's voice microphone is also canceled, so you don't have to worry about your microphone coming on. Now, this evening, we'll be doing a question and answer at the very end, and you can type your question either in the chat or in the Q&A, whichever you do prefer. And yeah, so welcome. There are 206 of you joining this evening, and so I do appreciate that. Well, flowering containers. What a wonderful, wonderful way to garden. And of course, we can create an entire flower bed totally in pots and planters and containers. And in fact, uh, probably most of the flowers that are sold in garden centers now probably end up in containers and pots and planters. So that's what we're going to talk about during this webinar, is all about pots and planters and getting things to bloom even better. And gosh, this allows us to produce flowers where it might not otherwise be possible to grow flowers. For example, I can picture myself sitting there on this balcony. Look at the beautiful flowers. I can picture myself sipping a cup of coffee there. And look at, even in the evening, a person can light up a balcony with flowers. Windows with window boxes and planters on railings just make everything come alive. And picture this for a minute. Wouldn't it be beautiful if on all these large apartment complexes in our cities and towns, wouldn't it be nice if even a third of those apartments on their decks or balconies planted something? Wouldn't that be beautiful? I can picture those big apartment buildings with a third or so. Wouldn't it be nice if everyone participated? But wouldn't that make these large complexes just beautiful in our cities if everyone would plant a little something out on their deck or balcony? And of course, in our own home yards, we can really just make things come alive by planting an assortment of things. And decks. A beautiful deck, isn't it? But wouldn't it look nicer with some plants added to it? Why, decks are just tailor-made for growing plants kind of in the corners or on the railings. Now, of course, here, maybe this is kind of a gardener gone wild, I guess, but they're certainly enjoying their plants out on their deck. But look at the way here that a deck, beautiful deck, has been turned into a total flower garden, all by using plants in containers. On the front door of a person's home is just very welcoming if we use containers by that front door. And one of the goals in home landscaping is to make your front entry of the home a focal point in the whole landscape. That will make it look welcoming as people look at your house, and it naturally steers the eye to that front door. And so planters just really make that front entry. Another great way to use planters, pots of flowers, is if you have a patio, to soften that hardscape by around the edges planting pots full of flowers or other plants, and it kind of blends that patio into the rest of the landscape. Also, in a beautiful landscape like this, notice how the containers have been used as a design element in that. Isn't that pretty the way that in kind of each of those, two of those corners there, as you walk along, they've used those beautiful planters. And so it can become part of the landscape. Nicely done landscape. And here, that kind of brick walkway or that brick patio there, look at the way that the container just kind of blends in and carries you into that beautiful flower bed. So using containers in spots like this helps to kind of bring that planting out onto the hardscape. Even in a flower bed, I mean, it's a beautiful flower bed, but notice the way that the planter, the container there, has been put in the middle of it or off to the center a little bit, and that gives some height to that flower bed, a nice arrangement. And in a perennial flower bed, notice the way that this container gives a pop of color to that perennial flower bed. In that perennial flower bed, it looks like there's some ornamental grasses and some lady's mantle and armeria and different things. But a container of annual flowers, and of course, annual flowers tend to bloom all and have color all summer long. So pots of annuals can tend to bridge the gap when some of the other perennials might not be in full bloom. By the way, the rose that is in that planter, as we talk a little bit later, roses aren't really recommended for containers because they don't overwinter well in our area in a container. But we could substitute an annual instead of that rose. But otherwise, pretty. Nice idea to add a pot of flowers into a perennial flower bed and window boxes. Beautiful. My wife Mary and I enjoy window boxes at the back of our house, our kitchen window. Not only looks nice from the outside, but also from the inside. It's pretty to see those flowers. So next, let's talk about some how-tos on this. Some ways that we can kind of make our planters look a little nicer, and kind of some of the mechanisms of how we can get our planters to look even better. All right. Well, first of all, of course, the emphasis here is that a pot has a drainage hole in, or more than one. So whatever container that we choose, it should be able to drain off the excess water. Because, for example, if we get a 3-inch rain, if it doesn't have drainage holes, it could easily drown the plants that are in it. And so most containers that are meant to be outdoors usually have drainage holes already in them. If they don't, we can easily drill holes into them. Oh, now here's an interesting concept. My mom, for her houseplants, always put some rocks in the bottom for drainage. And of course, she was a good gardener. Her houseplants did really, really well. But in the meantime, soil scientists have found that we don't need to put that layer of rocks in the bottom of a pot. In fact, they've determined that rocks in the bottom of a pot can actually um, deter the flow of water through. It can make drainage worse. Okay, now it sounds kind of counterintuitive, but here's why. Soil scientists found that if there are rocks in the bottom, it creates a layer of change. And when the potting mix is watered, the water goes down through the mix, and when it hits that layer of change, it stops and doesn't immediately drain away until the potting mix is supersaturated. Then the excess will drain through. But in the meantime, your plants could be overwatered. Now, my mom was a very good gardener. She knew not to overwater her plants. Uh, so the house plants, skip the rocks. Just put potting mix all the way from top to bottom. Good high quality potting mix isn't going to drip out the bottom drainage holes. However, in outdoor planters, uh, it's usually not the case of overwatering the plants because the wind and the sun and everything tends to dry them out. So outdoors in some of these large planters, just because it takes so much potting mix to go from top to bottom, outdoors it's okay if we put things in the bottom. And yes, It's maybe creating that layer of change. Maybe the water doesn't drain away as fast, but outdoors we're getting good sunshine, good air movement, and it's not as easy to overwatering things as it is a house plant, if you follow me. So a common question is on some of these great big high vertical planters, is it okay to put something in the bottom? And yes, it is. For example, on the left side, you see packing peanuts put down in the bottom. Now, I would rather see more potting mix than is shown there. I think I'd go about 2/3 of the depth in potting mix and then 1/3 of the packing peanuts. I'd like to see a little more potting mix for those plants to have enough root. Now on the right-hand side, I got kind of a kick out of it. It looks like they've emptied their recycle bin into the bottom of the pot. And so sometimes you will see people use pop cans or milk jugs or something like that to take up some of that space below. And that's fine. The potting mix will kind of find its way down in between there. And that does work to take up some space. Another option too is if you have some old potting mix, just put the old stuff down in the bottom and fill the top with new. We're going to talk about potting mix in just a minute. Again, if you have any questions as we're going along, feel free to add them to in either the Q&A or the chat. And again, everyone who is registered will receive the recording of our webinar. Okay, so the types of containers could be a classic urn-shaped container, a beautiful classic look, or could be something a little more free-formed. It's kind of interesting what people sometimes creativity will flow. It's kind of neat on the left-hand side, an old desk repurposed into a container. That's kind of neat, isn't it? I like the one on the right, the wheelbarrow with the plants flowing out. That's a kind of a beautiful naturalistic type planting. One thing that a person might consider too, especially by your front door, is to combine heights, containers of different heights, but all of the same style. Notice here how those three planters of all the similar type and color, but different heights. Notice the way they kind of make almost like a flower bed, such as that. It's pretty, isn't it? For example, this taller planter here, it's beautiful, isn't it? But picture that with the same style of container, same style, same color, but a little smaller, put down just kind of in the front into the side of that. And in most cases at garden centers and the national chain hardware stores, they usually have containers like that in a number of different sizes and heights. So a person might consider that too, that instead of one, have two, but of slightly different heights rather than both the same height. One thing that a person might consider with a container too is the depth. A shallow container like this is great for shallow rooted things like pansies, but that does mean that it would require watering almost daily during the summertime. So the size of the container does have a bearing on how much you're going to have to water it. So instead of a very small container, the larger, of course, is going to give you a little more freedom in how often that you need to water those planters. Next, let's talk about the mix that we put in the containers for growing. Now, the for sure not to use material is soil out of the garden or out of the flower beds, because the soil that would grow the very, very best crop of sweet corn, once it gets into a pot, just packs too solidly. And so that's why the potting mixes are blends of peat moss or coconut coir, composted bark, usually an organic component like that. And then they also have maybe chunks of bark, vermiculite, perlite or different drainage type materials. So it just works well in a container without packing. So that's why the potting mixes are the preferred instead of a garden type soil for these. Now, of course, a person can get some of the national brands. They work quite well. Even some of the national brands also have a moisture control type. The moisture control types are, they can help maintain the moisture a little bit better. So that they'll hold a little more moisture. And also, just by their kind of nature, not only do they hold moisture, but also they prevent it from becoming overly wet. So many of them have the product called coconut coir, COIR. Some of the products had a kind of a gel type material in it that would hold on to water. But I've noticed more and more of the materials on the moisture control are using coconut coir as a kind of a moisture holding component that is a good organic type material. Also, you might check with your local owned garden centers. They oftentimes will have the same mix that they use in their own greenhouse for all their pots. And of course, what the local owned garden centers use, they use the good stuff so that their plants grow extra well. So visit with your garden center too to see what brand that they might recommend for you as well. When filling up a container, fill it all the way up to the top or after you locate the plants in, make sure that that mix is pretty close to the top. Because when you give it its first watering, it's going to settle down some. Actually, after I pot up a container like that, I like to bounce it a little bit on the ground because it'll settle some. And if it settles very much, then I add a little more soil potting mix and then water it. And now here's why I suggest filling it up. Um, Notice here, and this is, I can't quite tell if it's either a pepper or a basil plant, but notice how it's planted too far down in. And there's a couple of reasons for not doing that. One is that pot isn't using the full amount of soil and it's not giving those roots the space. It's not giving them the full space because it's maybe about 1/3 empty. So the roots only got about 2/3 of the area instead of the whole pot. So instead, when potting these up, fill up the pot good, then plant your plants and it'll settle to just about the right amount of headspace. Headspace is the distance between the rim of the pot and the top of the potting mix. And so reasons for not sinking it down in like this. Okay, number one, there's not as much root space. Not enough, there's not as much soil for the roots to grow into. And also, if it's sunk down like that, you're not getting airflow across the soil surface. And that airflow helps prevent insects and diseases. And also, it does prevent overwatering. If it's sunk down in like that, then you just don't get the airflow across. Also, if you aren't using that full height of soil, gravity is not pulling the moisture down as efficiently. You see, if we filled that pot up with the full depth of soil, then when we water, gravity is going to be our friend. Gravity will help pull the moisture down and it'll bring air into the potting mix. So I know I'm kind of belaboring the point a little bit, but the reason is in both house plants and outdoor containers, I've noticed that if it's sunk down in like that, that's often when troubles arise. And so oftentimes ailing plants that are sent to me in pots, one thing that I've just noticed over the years is they haven't used up that full amount of soil. So that's why I kind of mentioned that to be sure. All right, now our container plants are very dependent on us for nutrition because their roots are consolidated in that pot. They can't go out into the surroundings searching for nutrients, so we need to give them what they need. Maybe the mix that you've bought says on the label that it feeds plants for up to 6 months. And you'll notice in that potting mix, you'll notice the little beads, such as the product on the left here. Those little beads of fertilizer are a slow release material that will slowly release the nutrients into the potting mix. So if your potting mix indicates that it that it feeds your plants for up to about 6 months, then you don't need to add those beads. But it usually will say on the label of that potting mix that you can still supplement it with a water-soluble type of fertilizer, such as the common Miracle-Gro box that you see on the right-hand side. So how often do we add water-soluble type of fertilizer? Um, to most containers, every couple of weeks or so is usually good. Follow the directions on the label, of course, for the quantities. But our outdoor containers, the annual flowers, are heavy feeders. That means they really respond well to the nutrients that we give. And if you've ever admired the large hanging baskets that are up and down the streets of Fargo or other cities or on our college campuses. Those are oftentimes fed continually. If you've ever noticed the water tank, they have kind of a bluish tint. And so they're often fed a kind of a weaker type of fertilizer, weaker rate of fertilizer with every watering, or sometimes once or so a week or every 2 weeks. The key point is that we give them regular fertilizing to supply them with the nutrition they need to keep on blooming. Now, how many plants should we put in a container? Now, when we go to visit the garden center, it's a good idea to have measured the containers that you have at home. Measure those with a tape measure. Maybe you slip the tape measure in your pocket and take it along to the garden center because it's surprising. I always think I'm going to remember what the diameter of our containers are, but by the time I get to garden center, I don't remember. And so the key to how many plants is what is the diameter of your container? So I always make a list of our various diameters of container because then once we get to the garden center can kind of help tell us, okay, for a 24-inch diameter pot, you need about this many plants. It's easy to get them too crowded. Now, when you're done, when you've got your plants, when you've bought your plants and you're assembling them into the container, if it looks like it's full and beautiful and ready to go, we've done it wrong. See, those plants need space to grow. So if as soon as you're done, it looks all nicely filled and beautiful, then we've overcrowded. Now, when my wife Mary and I had our garden center, oftentimes people would come in maybe a week before a graduation open house with a container and asking us to fill it up good. And they usually would mention, can you make it look really nice and full? Because we've got an open house. And of course, the goal of any graduation open house is to make people believe you live like that all year long. And so, anyway, there are purposes, there are reasons why you want it to look all full and finished immediately. But for most of us, we need to give them space to grow. So when we pot these up in May, it's okay if it doesn't look all full because we're giving each of the plant room to develop and they'll quickly grow and fill in. And in the long run, they're going to be better for it, for giving them a little space instead of overcrowding. Now, have you seen some of these that are kind of a ready-made combination, such as this drop and bloom, it looks like? So they've already put the combination together, and then you just slip that into your container. Now, I'd prefer probably to slip it out of that pot that it was purchased in and put it down in a bigger container. It looks like she's putting it in a bigger container, but I would slip it out of that nursery type pot and give it more soil space to grow outward. The other thing too, it looks pretty full already, so we're going to need to do a little trimming before the end of the season. And of course, at a certain point, maybe mid-season or so, when the containers look all nice and beautiful. If they start to get overcrowded, we can just do some trimming. We can, such as these beautiful coleus and things, we can do a little bit of trimming. If it starts like they're starting to get overcrowded and suffering from that. Okay, another key point is to, when you're assembling a container, when you're selecting the plants for it, to combine types with similar needs. For example, the planter here is one that does well in shade. So if you're looking at a shade or partially shaded spot, it's important to choose types that are all for shade or part shade. See, if we took that shaded spot and combine those shaded ones, if we put a petunia in, that petunia probably isn't going to grow as well because it would rather be in full sun. So for example, here, sun-loving plants, we've got geraniums and petunias, verbena, it looks like maybe some lantana, all sunny type plants. Even looks like some million bells in there. So they are all doing very well because they have similar needs. Now, have you heard when you've kind of investigated containers and how to kind of put them together and make them look nice and appealing? Have you heard the kind of the statement, a thriller, a spiller, and a filler? Kind of a clever, catchy thing, but it does guide us to a very good looking container. So the thriller means that in a container, you put something that's going to be kind of eye-catching. For example, there in the container you see, the ornamental grass is quite dramatic, gives some height also, but also the golden type marigold that catches a person's eye. The spiller is a type of plant that will vine over the edge, such as I believe it's scaviola, the kind of bluish lavender plant there. And also there's kind of a two-tone green and white yellow type plant. And so those trail over, those are the spillers. And of course, the filler would be ones such as I see some coleus in there that kind of fill and bring it all together. So when you're choosing plants, you might keep in mind for each container, it should have one or more thrillers, one or more spillers to carry over the edge and kind of soften the edge, and then filler, something that's going to kind of fill in any of the gaps between the two. So if we took a look at this, this is a pretty container. We've got the caladium, which are a very eye-catching thriller. And the spiller is the sweet potato vine. And filling in, we've got some impatiens there. I see some begonias and a plant called Purple Heart, which is also a nice house plant. So anyway, that of course would be a good shade type arrangement. And now here another good one. We've got the thriller, probably is the eye-catching coleus, and the begonias also. And we've got some probably dicandra over the edge. And of course here, if we just kind of look at all these beautifully put together arrangements, in each of those you can really see the thriller, a spiller over the edge, and filler. So those really do look quite nice. So good things to keep in mind for putting together our own. A few more examples here of that, the concept of the thriller, the filler, and the spiller. Gosh, beautiful, aren't they? Now, a little note about using geraniums in containers. Now, when my wife Mary and I had our garden center, we used to each year sell at least about 25,000 geraniums, and they are just a beautifully remarkable plant. They bloom all season from spring all the way through fall. There is one interesting thing about geraniums, though, if they're used in combinations, such as this large planter here actually has some geraniums there, you can see kind of the reddish, rose-colored blossoms peeking out, but they can often get lost in combinations. Many of the other types of plants that we use in containers become kind of more robust than the geraniums, and they can easily overtop a geranium. So we've started growing geraniums ourselves in our yard. Instead of putting them in combination, we'll grow them in pots just by themselves. A pot of geraniums. They're just beautiful, and then the geranium can round itself out and really shine without competing with the others. So you might consider that if ever you've found that your geraniums are being overtopped by some of the other more spreading or sprawly types of plants. Other types of plants also can just be planted just all by themselves. We don't always need a combination. For example, the beautiful petunias on the left-hand side, beautiful, just in a pot all by itself. And also the million bells, Calibrachoa on the right, they look very beautiful too, don't they? Just totally that. So we can use combinations of things, but we can also allow one single type of plant. And of course, with that petunia on the left-hand side, I'm sure there's at least three plants, maybe even five, put in that to make them look beautiful. And look at this, zinnias, a container just all zinnias, kind of a mixed color, but isn't that pretty? So even using just one type in container works well. Okay, a few more points about getting our containers to grow well and thrive all summer long. Deadheading. Deadheading is the gardening term for removing the faded blossoms, the spent blossoms as they wither. See, if a spent blossom is allowed to form a seed pod, that triggers those annual flowers to stop producing more blossoms. So your container can start to go downhill if we allow the spent blossoms to hold on. Now, on a geranium, if we clean them up by removing the spent blossoms, it makes the geraniums look a lot nicer, and it prevents the seed heads from forming. So on geraniums, we don't even need a scissors. We just grasp the flower stalk, bend it downward, and it will snap off cleanly. Now, on some, like petunias, it's not enough just to pull off the dried, withered, colored flower petals. Instead, what we're after for removing is that developing seed pod. So as you see there, a picture of someone holding the seed pod of a petunia. So we don't just pull off the withered blossom, we need to remove that developing seed pod. Now, one nice thing about many of the newer type of annual flowers, like many of the wave type petunias, they're self-cleaning. That's the term, gardening term for they just shed everything by themselves. We don't need to go in and deadhead. And many of them are also sterile. So many of the types of petunias don't set seed. So they self-clean and don't need deadheading. Of course, that's a great advantage. So if you see on a plant tag that it says it's self-cleaning or no deadheading needed, then that indicates that that plant has been bred to not need deadheading, a great labor-saving device. By mid-season, oftentimes we need to do a little trimming. For example, sweet potato vine grows so beautifully and so vigorously that oftentimes if it starts to kind of overpower some of the flowering type plants, we can just easily trim it back, and that gives the other plants chance to continue growing so that the one doesn't continue. Now, trees, shrubs, and perennials seldom survive in a container. So for our area, we're looking at annual type flowers are the preferred, because even perennials in a pot above ground don't winter the way that they do in an in-ground perennial bed. Also, roses in containers seldom survive. We would have to take kind of extraordinary means to get roses to winter in a container above ground. So we're looking primarily at annual type flowers are what we are looking for. Now, hanging baskets, beautiful. One point on hanging baskets is the larger the basket, the better. If it's a kind of a sale-priced hanging basket, oftentimes there'll be a smaller diameter, and those dry out so very rapidly. So if it's a smaller sale-priced basket that's too tempting to turn down, what you can do is take it home and repot it into a bigger container. Then it won't dry out quite as much also. And so, for example, these large kind of coconut fiber liners, they work very, very well for hanging baskets. You can get those in a kind of a larger size. So if the hanging basket that you buy from the garden center is kind of a smaller diameter, feel free just to take it out of that and carefully insert it into a larger um, basket such as you hear. That'll give it a little more growing space. Fuchsias. I wish fuchsias would grow better in our area, but fuchsias don't like wind. Sometimes if you've got it in a very wind-protected microclimate, sometimes they'll do beautifully, but fuchsias just don't like the wind. And so often they can be enjoyed the first part of the season, but in the wind and kind of sun, midsummer, oftentimes they won't look as nice, but that's kind of the way they are. All right, let's take a quick look at some of the flower types that we might use in our containers. And we are in good gardening times. There are so many new varieties of plants that have been developed specifically for containers. So at the garden center, you'll usually find these in pots. Maybe they're a 3-inch pot, a 4-inch pot, and they just are ready made for planting into our containers. Just so a brief overview of some of the types. On the left hand, one called Angelonia. They make kind of a nice taller statement in a combination. On the right hand are caladiums, the colorful leaved plants, and they do so well in sun or part shade. And if you're looking for some spiller type material, the dichondra is one you'll find at garden centers. The coleus on the right-hand side. Coleus has typically been a shade type plant. They do beautifully in containers. There are even some sun type coleus that do quite well in sun. So check the label, that'll tell. And coleus, there have been so many new developments of coleus. They're just such intense colors. So for a shade, part shade, boy, check out coleus. Lantana does very well in the sun. That's on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side is a fascinating plant called million bells, Calibrachoa. They're in the petunia family, so they kind of look like little miniature petunias. They love full sun. On the left-hand side are New Guinea impatiens. They'll do well in the shade, or some of the varieties will even do quite well in the sun. So check the label for those. Pansies on the right-hand side. Pansies are always such a good cheery plant. And also if by midsummer, if they don't quite like the heat and they've kind of gone out of bloom a little bit, you can trim those back and water them well, fertilize, and they'll bounce back. On the left-hand side, Scaviola, beautiful plant. On the right-hand side, sweet potato vine is the bright light green material that makes such a good spiller. And there are different varieties of sweet potato vines. There's the kind of the older green variety. But have you tried the new purplish type, the very dark purple? That makes a great accent in a container. There's even kind of a red leaf one. And here's one that I want to try. One with kind of a little bit of a jagged edge on. Those look quite interesting. And the garden centers are so full of all of these different types of plants that oftentimes when you're sitting there going up and down the aisles, it can be hard to choose because there are so many good types. On the left-hand side are begonias of a couple different types. There's dragon's wing begonia and one of our favorites, the lower left corner, the nonstop type of begonias that do so beautifully in shade and part shade. Another great one for full sun and heat are the zinnias. Watch the height because for containers, you'll want the short type of zinnias instead of the very tall. Oh, another one for our favorites for containers are the flowering vinca. Look at the size of the blossoms on those and the intensity of the color. Those work very well either by themselves in a container or in a mixed container. They're called vinca, flowering vinca. This particular variety is the Mega Bloom series, which was an All-America selection winners. Now on to the petunias. There have been so many wonderful petunia varieties developed for containers. And so the older petunia varieties that did so beautifully in flower beds are not as well adapted for containers. These specially developed ones. Have you tried the Supertunia called Vista Bubblegum, which is pictured there? It is absolutely beautiful, either in combination or just by itself. Just absolutely remarkable. Supertunia Vista Bubblegum. And there's a few different varieties, colors in that same series. Jazzberry is one, and that pretty purplish one in that same Supertunia. So these even do a little better in containers than the wave types. The wave type of petunias are beautiful in containers too. Sometimes they can get a little sprawly. So some of these, such as the Supertunia, fill out beautifully without getting quite so sprawly. And here's one of our favorites for containers at our own home. It was the petunia called Bee's Knees. It was an All-America winner from a few years ago. Beautiful. Now, many of these types of petunias that I mentioned, the Supertunia and Bee's Knees, they're not available for growing yourself from seed. In fact, they're sterile. They don't produce seed. So they are propagated by cuttings at the big wholesale garden centers, and then they're available at your local garden center. So most of those you need to buy plants of. And when we start talking about this, isn't it going to be wonderful for spring to come again? And so thank you very much for coming on a little container gardening journey with me. And if you have any questions at all, always feel free to email me. The email, and I'll leave that up for a little bit while we address some questions. The email is donald.kinzler@ndsu.edu. And again, we've got probably looks like maybe 17 or so questions. And so I'll get to that. But again, if you need to duck out early, it's a beautiful evening for a walk. If you need to duck out early, I will be sending the recording to everyone who's registered. And so again, thanks for joining. Now let's get to some questions. All right, let me get to the top here of them. Okay, I'm almost there. Approximately how many plants should go into an 18-inch pot? An 18-inch pot, I would do about 3 plants, especially if you buy these starter plants that are maybe in a 4-inch pot or so. An 18-inch pot, I would put about 3 plants in that. They'll fill in. As a general guideline, how many plants should you plant for the diameter of a pot? Kind of a related question. So an 18-inch pot, I'd go about 3. 24-inch pot, I'd do 4 to 5. And then maybe go upward as you go. So I hope that answers. 18-inch pot, I'd say 3. 24-inch pot, probably 4 to 5. And then onward and upward from there. On the combo pots that you buy to put in another container, do you replace the soil? Some of those combo ones seem to have poor soil that dries out quickly. That's a great question. So those kind of ready-made combinations that you take home, and I mentioned to slip out of the nursery pot and into your own container, don't totally bare root those plants because that's going to set them back and tear the roots apart, but kind of tease the outer area of the root ball, tease those roots apart a little bit, and on the top, maybe get rid of a little bit of that soil mix that it's in without totally disturbing the plants and the roots, and then put it into your larger container, and then put soil around and a little fresh soil up on the top. So that'll give something fresh, some fresh potting mix for those plants to chew on. But I agree, some of those combo type pots seem to have a soil that is so root bound already that it's hard to keep it wet enough. Okay, I have found that some plants like to take over the pot space and the roots crowd out their pot mates. Think sweet potato vine. I agree. Am I missing something? I tend to avoid some of those more vigorous plants because of that. Any thoughts? Yes, like sweet potato and some of the ones just they will vine. And so it does mean that when using those, for one thing, start with a big enough container. because they're going to take a massive amount of root space, and also trim them by midsummer so that they aren't overtopping the others. But yeah, they do produce massive roots. Someone mentions they love the dichondra. That's a beautiful plant for kind of a spiller. Ideas for flowers that the deer will not eat other than petunias. No. There are actually no plants the deers won't eat. That may sound kind of harsh, but if deer are hungry enough, they'll eat almost anything. Now you can Google container plants that the deer won't eat. But when I've examined those lists, I've had almost all of those plants eaten by deer at some point or another. So if deer are hungry enough, they're going to eat almost anything. So the best defense is probably to apply something like liquid fence, or plant skid is another good repellent on those. So unfortunately, um, when a person recommends a deer-proof plant, there's almost certain to be somebody that will say, "Yeah, but the deer did eat mine," and that's been my experience. So it's probably best to go the repellent route, liquid fence or plant skid on that. Two questions: does the potting mix with fertilizer included give a cushion on fertilizing every other week? And yes, the potting mix with little fertilizer granules usually will say on the label that you can supplement with weekly or every other week water soluble type. Also, what ornamental grass is good for container gardening? Now, when you go to the garden center and are looking for container plants, uh, and you'd like an ornamental grass in the container because they do look beautifully, don't go to the perennial section because those ornamental grasses are for perennial flower beds. But most garden centers will have annual type grasses. Um, and I'm trying to remember the name. It's on the tip of my tongue, but there is one that is especially beautiful, kind of a purplish tint. On my drive home tonight, I'll remember it certainly. But look for in the all the container plants, look for the annual type grasses. Most garden centers sell potted plants of annual grasses that are just beautiful in that, maybe a few different types. Do you winter sow seed? I've never winter sowed in like the gallon jugs in which you plant seeds, and I've never done that, but I'm going to do that with onions and some lettuce this year. Do you recommend clay pots with or without glazing? Now, clay pots I love for houseplants indoors because they breathe, the unglazed type, they breathe through the outside, and overwatering is less of a possibility with unglazed clay pots. But now outdoors is kind of the opposite. Oftentimes we have a hard time keeping our containers wet enough. So unglazed clay pots will tend to dry out quicker. So outdoors, the glazed clay pots will tend to conserve moisture maybe a little better. All right, next question. Can I add wood chips in the container before adding the potting soil? Now, wood chips would be an okay filler down in the bottom, but it would be important not to mix the wood chips into the potting mix. And here's why. As the wood chips, unless they were composted already, wood chips added to potting mix will tend to rob some of the nitrogen nutrients because as the little microbes that decay those wood chips, as they're doing their decaying, they tend to tie up some nitrogen. So the wood chips should be kept out of the root zone on those, unless they're composted type chips already. Purple fountain grass. Thank you. That's what I was trying to remember. The name of the beautiful, beautiful grass for containers. Purple fountain grass. Thank you, Connie. Another one, Mary mentions purple fountain grass, Pennisetum rubrum. Thank you. Now I don't have to try to remember that on the drive home. Can I put a layer of wood chips in the container? Yeah, that okay. We answered that one. Okay, those were in the chat. Now I'm going to go to the Q&A quickly here. Do the horticultural products like better than rocks inhibit normal drainage like a layer of rocks would do? Now, I'm guessing, I'm not familiar with the better than rocks, but I'm guessing that that might be a material such as styrofoam down in the bottom, just to kind of take up some of that space on a very tall planter. And so again, for a house plant indoors, we don't want that layer of change because it can impede drainage and it can make the soil wetter. Outdoors, that's usually not the problem. So a material down in the bottom, even though if it maybe keeps the soil a little wetter, outdoors, that's probably a good thing. So my hunch is that the better than rocks is probably outdoors okay, but indoors, I probably wouldn't use it. How do you get rid of fungus gnats? The product called mosquito bits or mosquito dunks actually is labeled also for fungus gnats. So mosquito dunks is kind of a round little chunk that you put in your watering can, let it dissolve, and mosquito bits you apply to the soil. It is a beneficial bacteria that inoculates the soil with a bacteria that kills the fungus gnat larvae. It takes a little bit, it takes a little while to become effective, but it will kill the larvae of the fungus gnats. The fungus gnats are those little black annoying flies that has a life cycle in the soil mix. And mosquito dunks or mosquito bits will break that life cycle of the fungus gnats. Next question from Tracy. Should you put weed fabric separating the packing peanuts and the potting soil to keep the soil in place? Well, one of two things is going to happen. I think the weed fabric separating the two is probably a good thing. Or if you don't put the weed fabric to separate them, the potting mix is going to filter down in between the material that you put down in there, for example, pop cans or milk jugs. And you don't want the whole thing to settle way down in. So if you don't use some sort of fabric separating to keep the potting mix up, you should probably fill the container, make sure you jiggle it good so that the potting mix filters down in if I'm, if you're following me. So I like the idea of putting a weed fabric uh, to keep the soil up above and so it doesn't all just disappear down in. Do you mix potting soil in the potting mix? Actually, potting soil is kind of a misnomer. Most of the potting type materials do not have actual soil. So potting mix is the kind of preferred term. So now the type not to use would be the bags of garden soil. So if it actually contains like garden soil, those are products you'd use to fill like a depression in the lawn, bags of garden soil. So in the potting mix, you just use those straight without adding any soil into that. And a good high quality mix will have good drainage, yet will retain moisture fine. Next question. Can you provide a chart of some kind to give us a general idea of how many plants can go in containers of various diameters and heights? Yes, along with the recording of this, I'll send a chart of that. So in a couple of days when the recording is ready, I'll send. I believe I do have a chart of that. Next question. Which type of geranium, zonal or question for outdoors? Now, a zonal geranium, we don't hear that term too often anymore. A zonal geranium is another term for a geranium grown from a cutting, as opposed to a seed-grown geranium. And also the zonal geraniums tend to have a zone of slightly darker green or almost a burgundy green in the leaves. So for outdoor, we of course prefer these zonal type geraniums, those grown from cuttings. I feel they bloom better. So zonal geraniums are great for outdoors. Also, any of the ivy or hanging basket type geraniums are beautiful for outdoors. For those of us who love zone 5 or above, Japanese maples, what are tricks for helping a containerized maple survive and overwinter? Yes, the Japanese maples, where the climate is more mild, Japanese maple can be a beautiful plant for a larger type container. If you did want to try a Japanese maple in a container, uh, one thing you can do is move it into a very protected side of the house for the winter. Again, it needs to stay outdoors. Don't put it on the south side because the sun will warm it up and then it gets cold and warm and etc. Put it over on a sheltered side of the house and cover it with just as much, cover the container with just as much straw or leaves or something to get that to winter. Excuse me. Possibly you could try wintering it in a garage, but wintering anything in a garage can be kind of iffy because when we raise the garage doors, there's such a dramatic change in temperature. Next question, how do you handle hanging baskets with our North Dakota winds so they don't blow away? Yes, and that is the downside of the fuchsias. Fuchsia, beautiful, but they just don't tolerate wind. So, hanging basket in our North Dakota wind, um, well, one thing a person can do is start with very sturdy type material. By sturdy, I mean plants and leaves that have some substance to them. Hanging geranium, ivy leaf geranium with its waxy coating is quite, reliable for the wind. But, that's definitely, I probably don't have a real good way to try to keep the hanging baskets from blowing away. How often should potting soil be replaced? I didn't mention that. Do you have to start with brand new potting mix every year? And no, you don't. Mary and I have used the same potting mix for years and years. I bet some of it's at least 10 years old. But a couple of suggestions for that is in the fall of the year, remove all the plants. Don't let them stay in there over winter. Remove all the plants in the fall of the year. Take away any leaf debris that can harbor diseases and insects. And each year, take out about a fourth or so of the old, blend in some new. And after one growing season, those little beads of fertilizer are going to be long gone. So when you reuse potting mix, again, start with a high quality potting mix. When you reuse it, watch the nutrition. Uh, Add the little beads of Osmocote or use water soluble type. But you should make sure you fertilize. But potting soil, high quality, can certainly be reused. Okay, Barry mentions that the deer love my sweet potato in containers. Yes, sweet potato vine is like deer candy. How to keep them away? Because they are so beautiful. I'd hate to not plant sweet potato vines, but try one of the two repellents, liquid fence or plant skid. Plant and then SKYDD. Garden centers do sell them. No repellents are 100%, unfortunately, but it's probably the best bet on that. All right, next, Pat asks, my hanging plants always die out in the center. What can I do? Okay, hanging plants, a couple of things. At a certain point in midsummer, when all the good growth tends to be going to the outside and the center opens up, you can trim them back. That will encourage some branching at the base and then also fertilize. But also, um, try to go for some of the newer varieties of petunia, such as those Vista bubblegum type petunias. They tend to stay fuller at the center, the lower center, instead of getting so sprawly. The other thing that I noticed too, in watering both containers and hanging baskets, try not to water down in the middle of it. Um, Try not to try not to put your watering wand right down focused on the center of the plant, because I've noticed that can tend to diminish the center. Instead, kind of sneak the watering wand in from the side a little bit, and because sometimes just the act of watering can tend to diminish the center. Can you grow nonstop begonias from seed? Yes. In fact, we started ours in February. They're nice little plantlets, but it's not too late, but I do it fairly soon. Nonstop begonias from seed. Yes, you sure can. Start them quickly. Should you use different potting soil in the pot, or can you reuse from prior year? Yep, there's another good question. Yep, you can sure reuse. What about planting spring bulbs in containers and putting in the garage so squirrels don't dig them out? Yeah, spring bulbs in containers and put in the garage. Spring bulbs planted in the fall, so they'll bloom in spring, need a winter chilling effect. So you could certainly plant them in containers, water them well in the fall, and then move them into the garage so that you're sure that they're getting temperatures down in the 30s. A refrigerator indoors works, so they don't totally need to freeze, but as long as they're in the 30s, mid 30s, then they'll come up in the spring. So Gene, I think that's a good idea. Karen asks, the pots in front of my garage are in full sun, intense wind all the time. Do you have flower recommendations that can handle both of these? So full sun and intense wind all the time. One of the great flowers that I'd include in a mix like that would be zinnia, the low growing type of zinnia. And of course, marigolds, the low growing type, would work quite well. And I would certainly try some of the petunias, such as the Vista bubblegum, unless you've tried those and find it still too windy. But make sure you include zinnias in that mix also. I know the wind is certainly a challenge for drying out, especially. What flowers are the best, easiest to grow from seed indoors? Marigolds are wonderful and reliable. They come up so vigorous from seed indoors. Zinnias are quite nice. Petunias do quite well. About early March, about now, would be the time to seed petunias. For zinnias, you can wait until first part of April or even mid-April. Marigolds about March 15th. What would be a good drought-tolerant plant for containers? Moss roses, portulaca do beautifully even when it dries out. Zinnias and marigolds all do very well. I live in the country facing north. The wind is an issue. Are there flowers you can recommend for windy conditions? And again, that's as others have asked too. The wind is certainly a problem. Um, and of course, on the north side, if it's shady, even things like coleus tend to just get battered so heavily. I'm going to be hard pressed to come up with a wind friendly plant on the north side. You've probably tried impatiens. I'd maybe try begonias. Begonias with their waxier leaf, just the fibrous rooted begonias with their waxy leaves can handle a little more wind than some plants. All right. And Susan says, thank you. I appreciate that. Do you have a good potting mix recipe? In the old days, my early days of gardening, we would blend 1/3 peat moss, 1/3 of a good loamy soil, and 1/3 perlite. The garden centers have done all that for us. So now I buy the bagged mix. It really is superior to anything that I used to mix up. So instead of mixing up, I buy a good high quality potting mix, and that saves me a lot of work and gives me a better product. I would love window boxes, but my location faces north. Are there flowers that do better? Yes, for a north coleus, beautiful in window boxes. Impatiens, and Coleus impatiens, begonias do beautiful. Pansies would do well. Any of those could be used separately or in combinations. I am already picturing it. For spider mites, does a spray insecticide work better than a systemic one? Spider mites, a systemic granules that you add to the soil that are taken up internally by the plant, and as the spider mites suck the sap, the spider mites are killed Systemic is good. The problem is outdoors is systemic could affect the bees that visit. So systemic on outdoor flower beds probably isn't the best choice. So a spray insecticide such as insecticidal soap or neem oil would probably be a better choice for outdoors. Yes, thanks again. Another one helped me remember purple fountain grass. Yeah, thanks. A number of you mentioned. What about pine cones in the bottom of your pots? Pine cones would work. Yes, in the bottom of the pots to take up some space. Is it okay to use wood chips as a top mulch? This seems to help mine retain moisture. Yes, a mulch on the top of pots, such as wood chips, shredded bark, would work well. Again, I mentioned before not mixing that down into the mix because that would tie up nitrogen, but as a coating, as a mulch layer up on the top, that's a great idea. Wood chips, shredded bark up on top to help them from drying out a little bit. Do you wet down potting mix before you begin planting? Yes, in any of the houseplant or seeding type webinars that I do, I always mention to moisten down the potting mix. In fact, thanks for reminding me. When I do this webinar again, I'm going to add that. Yes, the potting mixes are oftentimes just so bone dry. And so I always wet it down the day before I'm going to use it, and it becomes much more mellow. So yeah, thanks. When I do this again, I'm going to add that in the potting mix section. What is a good source to find native plants? Um, do a Google search for native plants Minnesota or native plants Sheldon, North Dakota. Native plants, Minnesota, you'll come up with some very good northern sources of native plants. And there's also a grower down in the Sheldon area. And so I don't have the name of that, but try Googling native plants, Sheldon, North Dakota. When it's hot and humid in late summer, plants decline. Would it help to move to the north side of the house in the shade? Yes. In the heat of the summer, most of our annual flowers don't like it hot. I mean, zinnias do, marigolds do, portulaca do, but geraniums don't like the heat. Most of the others don't like it real hot and humid. So if we're getting a stretch of 100-degree days, like Kathy mentioned here, yes, maybe move them to a shaded spot, or at least in the afternoon. Move them to a little bit of protection. Another question, if you bought potting soil last fall with fertilizer but didn't use it, would the fertilizer still be good? Yes, the fertilizer is moisture activated, so chances are in that bag, the potting mix was relatively dry. And so the fertilizer should still be good in that unopened bag of potting soil, potting mix. Is there a new annual you're excited to try this year? I'm going to do Deco Max Pink Supertunia and Big Duck Yellow Marigold. Yes, Big Duck Yellow Marigold is my favorite, grows to about 18 to 24 inches. I use it in flower beds. Might be a little large for a container, but it'd probably do okay. And Deco Max Pink Supertunia. That'll be a good one too. I'm excited to try all of the new All-America winners. Okay, I think we're almost to the last question. Jean mentions I put black fabric under my elevated raised beds, and the deer haven't jumped the fence into that garden like they do in the other gardens. Oh, no, that's interesting. Put black fabric under elevated raised beds, and deer haven't jumped into that garden like they do. Now that's interesting. I don't know if the use of black fabric under would have some sort of effect on the deer. That's possible, but yeah, I'm not sure. I'll have to kind of keep my ears open for that. Thank you, Gene. That's the first kind of I've mentioned that. That'll be interesting. It'd be nice if that would be kind of a consistent deer repellent, black fabric kind of in the area. Well, there, I believe we've come to the end of our questions. I think I've checked them all. And so thank you all very much. We had really a nice group this evening. Looks like there were almost 180 or so that stayed to listen to the questions even. So again, thank you. I really appreciate it. And my next webinar is one week from tonight on vegetable gardening. I will send the registration link to that to all of you who registered for tonight's webinar. And so if you are looking forward to vegetable gardening, maybe you'd like to tune into that one as well. Again, thank you all very much. I really enjoy our chats on these evenings. Thanks, and have a very good evening.